Foxe's Book of Martyrs, the 10th persecution under Diocletian AD 303. Under the Roman emperors, commonly called the era of the martyrs, was occasioned partly by the increasing numbers and luxury of the Christians and the hatred of Galerius, the adopted son of Diocletian, who, being stimulated by his mother, a bigoted pagan, never ceased persuading the emperor to enter upon the persecution till he had accomplished his purpose. The fatal day fixed upon to commence the bloody work was the 23rd of February, AD 303, that being the day in which the Terminalia were celebrated, and on which, as the cruel pagans boasted, they hoped to put a termination to Christianity. On the appointed day, the persecution began in Nicomedia, on the morning of which the prefect of the city repaired, with a great number of officers and assistants, to the church of the Christians, where, having forced open the doors, they seized upon all the sacred books, committed them to the flames. The whole of this transaction was in the presence of Diocletian and Galerius, who, not content with burning the books, had the church leveled with the ground. This was followed by a severe edict commanding the destruction of all other Christian churches and books, and an order was succeeded to render Christians of all denominations outlaws. The publication of this edict occasioned an immediate martyrdom, for a bold Christian not only tore it down from the place to which it was affixed, but execrated the name of the emperor for his injustice. A provocation like this was sufficient to call down pagan vengeance upon his head. He was accordingly seized, severely tortured, and then burned alive. All the Christians were apprehended and imprisoned, and Galerius privately ordered the imperial palace to be set on fire, that the Christians might be charged as the incendiaries, and a plausible pretense given for carrying on the persecution with the greatest severities. A general sacrifice was commenced, which occasioned various martyrdoms. No distinction was made of age or sex. The name of Christian was so obnoxious to pagans that all indiscriminately fell sacrifices to their opinions. Many houses were set on fire, and whole Christian families perished in the flames, and others had stones fastened about their necks, and being tied together were driven into the sea. The persecution became general in all the Roman provinces, but more particularly in the east, and as it lasted 10 years, it is impossible to ascertain the numbers martyred or to enumerate the various modes of martyrdom. Racks, scourges, swords, daggers, crosses, poison, and famine were made use of in various parts to dispatch the Christians. An invention was exhausted to devise tortures against such. Phrygia, consisting entirely of Christians, was burnt, and all the inhabitants perished in the flames. Tired with slaughter, at length several governors of provinces represented to the imperial court the impropriety of such conduct. Hence, many were respited from execution, but though they were not put to death, as much as possible was done to render their lives miserable, many of them having their ears cut off, their noses slit, their right eye put out, their limbs rendered useless by dreadful dislocations, and their flesh seared in conspicuous places with red-hot irons. It is necessary now to particularize the most conspicuous persons who laid down their lives in martyrdom in this bloody persecution. Sebastian, a celebrated martyr, was born at Narbonne in Gaul, instructed in the principles of Christianity at Milan, and afterward became an officer of the Emperor's Guard in Rome. He remained a true Christian in the midst of idolatry, unallured by the splendors of a court, untainted by evil examples, and uncontaminated by the hopes of preferment. Refusing to be a pagan, the emperor ordered him to be taken to a field near the city, termed the Campus Martius, and there to be shot to death with arrows, which sentence was executed accordingly. Some pious Christians, coming to the place of execution in order to give his body burial, perceived signs of life in him, and immediately Moving him to a place of security, they, in a short time, effected his recovery and prepared him for a second martyrdom. For as soon as he was able to go out and placed himself intentionally in the emperor's way as he was going to the temple, and reprehended him for his various cruelties and unreasonable prejudices against Christianity. As soon as Diocletian had overcome his surprise, he ordered Sebastian to be seized and carried to a place near the palace and beaten to death, and that the Christian should not either use means again to recover or bury his body. He ordered that it should be thrown into the common sewer. Nonetheless, a Christian lady named Lucina found means to remove it from the sewer and bury it in the catacombs, or repositories of the dead. The Christians about this time, upon mature consideration, thought it unlawful to bear arms under a heathen emperor. Maximilian, the son of Fabius Victor, was the first beheaded under this regulation. Vitus, a Sicilian of considerable family, was brought up as a Christian. When his virtues increased with his years, his constancy supported him under all afflictions, and his faith was superior to the most dangerous perils. His father, Hylas, who was a pagan, finding that he had been instructed in the principles of Christianity by the nurse who brought him up, used all his endeavors to bring him back to paganism, and at length sacrificed his son to the idols, June 14th, AD 303. Victor was a Christian of a good family at Marseille, in France. He spent a great part of the night in visiting the afflicted and confirming the weak, which pious work he could not, consistently with his own safety, perform in the daytime, and his fortune he spent in relieving the distresses of poor Christians. He was at length, however, seized by the Emperor's Maximian's decree, who ordered him to be bound and dragged through the streets. During the execution of this order, he was treated with all manner of cruelties and indignities by the enraged populace. Remaining still inflexible, his courage was deemed obstinacy. Being by order stretched upon the rack, he turned his eyes towards heaven and prayed to God to endure him with patience, after which he underwent the tortures with admirable fortitude. Although the executioners were tired with inflicting torments on him, he was conveyed to a dungeon. In his confinement, he converted his jailers, named Alexander, Felician, and Longinus. This affair coming to the ears of the emperor, he ordered them immediately to be put to death, and the jailers were accordingly beheaded. Victor was then again put in the rack, unmercifully beaten with batons, and again sent to prison. Being a third time examined concerning his religion, he persevered in his principles. A small altar was then brought, and he was commanded to offer incense upon it immediately. Fired with indignation at the request, he boldly stepped forward and with his foot overthrew both altar and idol. This so enraged the Emperor Maximian, who was present, that he ordered the foot with which he had kicked the altar to be immediately cut off, and Victor was thrown into a mill and crushed to pieces with the stones, AD 303. Maximus, governor of Cilicia, being at Tarsus, 3 Christians were brought before him. Their names were Tarachus, an aged man, Probus, and Andronicus. After repeated tortures and exhortations to recant, they at length were ordered for execution. Being brought to the amphitheater, several beasts were let loose upon them, but none of the animals, though hungry, would touch them. The keeper then brought out a large bear that had that very day destroyed 3 men. But this vicious creature and a fierce lioness both refused to touch the prisoners. Finding the design of destroying them by the means of wild beasts ineffectual, Maximus ordered them to be slain by sword on the 11th of October, AD 303. Romanus, a native of Palestine, was deacon of the church of Caesarea at the time of the commencement of Diocletian's persecution. Being condemned for his faith at Antioch, he was scourged, put to the rack, his body was torn with hooks, his flesh cut with knives, his face scarified, his teeth beaten from their sockets, and his hair plucked out by the roots. Soon after, he was ordered to be strangled, November 17th, AD 303. Susanna, the niece of Caius, bishop of Rome, was pressed by the Emperor Diocletian to marry a noble pagan who was nearly related to him. Refusing the honor intended her, she was beheaded by the emperor's orders. Dorotheus, the high chamberlain of the household to Diocletian, was a Christian and took great pains to make converts. In his religious labors, he was joined by Gorgonius, another Christian, and one belonging to the palace. They were first tortured, then strangled. Peter, a eunuch belonging to the emperor, was a Christian of singular modesty and humility. He was laid on a gridiron and broiled over a slow fire until he expired. Cyprian, known by the title of the Magician to distinguish him from Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, was a native of Antioch. He received a liberal education in his youth and particularly applied himself to astrology, after which he traveled for improvement through Greece, Egypt, India, etc. In the course of time, he became acquainted with Justina, a young lady of Antioch, whose birth, beauty, and accomplishments rendered her the admiration of all who knew her. A pagan gentleman applied to Cyprian to promote his suit with the beautiful Justina. This he undertook, but soon himself became converted, burnt his books of astrology and magic, received baptism, and felt animated with a powerful spirit of grace. The conversion of Cyprian had a great effect on the pagan gentleman who paid his addresses to Justina, and he, in short time, embraced Christianity. During the persecution of Diocletian, Cyprian and Justina were seized upon as Christians. When the former was torn with pincers, and the latter chastised, and after suffering other torments, were beheaded. Eulalia, a Spanish lady of a Christian family, was remarkable in her youth for sweetness of temper and solidity of understanding, seldom found in the capriciousness of juvenile years. Being apprehended as a Christian, the magistrate attempted by the mildest means to bring her over to paganism, but she ridiculed the pagan deities with such asperity that the judge, incensed at her behavior, ordered her to be tortured. Her sides were accordingly torn by hooks, and her breasts burnt in the most shocking manner, till she expired by the violence of the flames, December AD 303. In the year 304, when the persecution reached Spain, Dacian, the governor of Tarragona, ordered Valerius, the bishop, and Vincent, the deacon, to be seized, loaded with irons, and imprisoned. The prisoners being firm in their resolution, Valerius was banished, and Vincent was racked, and his limbs dislocated, his flesh torn with hooks, and was laid on a gridiron, which had not only a fire placed under it, but spikes at the top, which ran into his flesh. These torments neither destroying him nor changing his resolutions. He was remanded to prison and confined in a small, loathsome, dark dungeon strewn with sharp flints and pieces of broken glass, where he died in January 22nd, 304. His body was thrown into the river. The persecutions of Diocletian began particularly to rage in AD 304, when many Christians were put to cruel tortures and the most painful and ignominious deaths, the most eminent and particular of whom we shall enumerate. Saturninus, a priest of Albatina, a town in Africa, after being tortured, was rendered to prison and there starved to death. His 4 children, after being variously tormented, shared the same fate with their father. Dativus, a noble Roman senator, Tellico, a pious Christian, Victoria, a young lady of considerable family and fortune, with some others of less consideration, all auditors of Saturninus, were tortured in a similar manner and perished by the same means. Agrippa, Chiroma, and Irene, 3 sisters, were seized upon at Thessalonica when Diocletian's persecution reached Greece. They were burnt and received the crown of martyrdom in the flames, March 25th, AD 304. The governor, finding that he could make no impression on Irene, ordered her to be exposed naked in the streets, which shameful order having been executed, she was burnt April 1, AD 304, at the same place where her sisters suffered. Agatho, a man of a pious turn of mind, with Cassisi, Philippa, and Etusia were martyred about the same time, but the particulars have not been transmitted to us. Marcellinus, Bishop of Rome, who succeeded Caius in the see, having strongly opposed paying divine honors to Diocletian, suffered martyrdom by a variety of tortures in the year 321, comforting his soul till he expired with the prospect of those glorious rewards it would receive by the tortures suffered in the body. Victorius, Carpoporus, Severus, and Severianus were brothers, and all four employed in places of great trust and honor in the city of Rome. Having exclaimed against the worship of idols, they were apprehended and scourged with the plumtae or scourges, at the ends of which were fastened leaden balls. This punishment was exercised with such excess of cruelty that the pious brothers fell martyrs to its severity. Timothy, a deacon of Mauritania, and Mora, his wife, had not been united together by the bands of wedlock above 3 weeks, when they were separated from each other by the persecution. Timothy, being apprehended as a Christian, was carried before Arianus, the governor of Thebais, who, knowing that he had the keeping of the Holy Scriptures, commended him to deliver them to be burnt. To which he answered, "Had I children, I would sooner deliver them up to be sacrificed than part of the word of God." The governor, being much incensed at this reply, ordered his eyes to be put out with a red-hot iron, saying, "The book shall at least be useless to you, for you shall not see to read them." His patience under the operation was so great that the governor grew more exasperated. He, therefore, in order, if possible, to overcome his fortitude, ordered him to be hung by his feet, with a weight tied about his neck and a gag in his mouth. In this state, Mora, his wife, tenderly urged him for her sake to recant. But when the gag was taken out of his mouth, instead of consenting to his wife's entreaties, he greatly blamed her mistaken love and declared his resolution of dying for the faith. The consequences was that Mora resolved to imitate his courage and fidelity, and either to accompany or follow him to glory. The governor, after trying in vain to alter her resolution, ordered her to be tortured, which was executed with great severity. After this, Timothy and Mora were crucified near each other, AD 304. Sabinus, bishop of Assisium, refused to sacrifice to Jupiter, and pushing the idol from him, had his hand cut off by the order of the governor of Tuscany. While in prison, he converted the governor and his family, all of whom suffered martyrdom for the faith. Soon after the execution, Sabinus himself was scourged to death, December AD 304. Tired with the farce of state and public business, the Emperor Diocletian resigned the imperial diadem and was succeeded by Constantius and Galerius, the former prince of the most mild and humane disposition, and the latter equally remarkable for his cruelty and tyranny. These divided the emperor into two equal governments, Galerius ruling in the east and Constantius in the west. And the people in the two governments felt the effects of the dispositions of the two emperors. For those in the west were governed in the mildest manner, but such as resided in the east felt all then miseries of oppression and lengthened tortures. Among the many martyred by the order of Galerius, we shall enumerate the most eminent. Amphianus was a gentleman of eminence in Lucia, and a scholar of Eusebius. Gelida, a Lyconian of royal descent, but more celebrated for her virtues than noble blood. While on the rack, her child was killed before her face. Gelida of Cappadocia was a lady of distinguished capacity, great virtue, and uncommon courage. To complete the execution, Gelida had boiling pitch poured on her feet, her sides torn with hooks, and recovered the conclusion of her martyrdom by being beheaded, April 16th, AD 305. Hermelas, a venerable and pious Christian of great age and an intimate acquaintance of Pantaleon, suffered martyrdom for the faith on the same day and in the same manner as Pantaleon. Eustratius, secretary to the governor of Armenia, was thrown into a fiery furnace for exhorting some Christians who had been apprehended to persevere in their faith. Nicander and Mercian, two eminent Roman military officers, were apprehended on account of their faith. As they were both men of great abilities in their profession, the utmost means were used to induce them to renounce Christianity, but these endeavors being found ineffectual, they were beheaded. In the kingdom of Naples, several martyrdoms took place, in particular January's Bishop of Beneventum, Socius, Deacon of Messine Proculus, Eutychus and Assudius, two laymen, Festus, a deacon, and Desiderius, a reader, were all, on account of being Christians, condemned by the governor of Campania to be devoured by the wild beasts. The savage animals, however, not touching them, they were beheaded. Quirinius, bishop of Siccia, being carried before Metenius, the governor, was ordered to sacrifice to the pagan deities, agreeably to the edict of various Roman emperors. The governor, perceiving his constancy, sent him to jail and ordered him to be heavily ironed, flattering himself that the hardships of a jail, some occasional tortures, and the weight of chains might overcome his resolution. Being decided in his principles, he was sent to Amantius, the principal governor of Pannonia, now Hungary, who loaded him with chains and carried him through the principal towns of the Danube, exposing him to ridicule wherever he went. Arriving at length at Sabaria, finding that Quirinius would not renounce his faith, he ordered him to be cast into a river with a stone fastened about his neck. This sentence being put into execution, Quirinius floated about for some time, and, exhorting the people in the most pious terms, concluded his admonitions with this prayer: "It is no new thing, O all-powerful Jesus, for thee to stop the course of rivers or to cause a man to walk upon the water, as thou didst thy servant Peter. The people have already seen the proof of thy power in me. Grant me now to lay down my life for thy sake, O my God." On pronouncing the last words, he immediately sank and died June 4th, AD 308. His body was afterwards taken up and buried by some pious Christians. Pamphilius, a native of Phoenicia of a considerable family, was a man of such extensive learning that he was called a second Origen. He was received into the body of the clergy at Caesarea, where he established a public library and spent his time in the practice of every Christian virtue. He copied the greatest part of the works of Origen with his own hand, and assisted by Assudius, gave a correct copy of the Old Testament, which had suffered greatly by the ignorance or negligence of former transcribers. In the year 307, he was apprehended and suffered torture and martyrdom. Marcellius, Bishop of Rome, being banished on account of his faith, fell a martyr to the miseries he suffered in exile, 16th of January, AD 310. Peter, the 16th Bishop of Alexandria, was martyred on November 25th, AD 311, by order of Maximius Caesar, who reigned in the East. Agnes, a virgin of only 13 years of age, was beheaded for being a Christian, as was Cyrene, the empress of Diocletian. Valentine, a priest, suffered the same fate at Rome, and Erasmus, a bishop, was martyred in Campania. Soon after this, the persecution abated in the middle parts of the empire, as well as in the west, and Providence at length began to manifest vengeance on the persecutors. Maximian endeavored to corrupt his daughter Fausta to murder Constantine, her husband. She discovered, and Constantine forced him to choose his own death, when he preferred ignominious death of hanging after being an emperor nearly 20 years. Galerius was visited by an incurable and intolerable disease, which began with an ulcer in his secret parts and a fistula in ano that spread progressively to his innermost bowels and baffled all the skills of physicians and surgeons. Untried medicines of some daring professors drove the evil through his bones to the very marrow, and worms began to breed in his entrails, and the stench was so preponderant as to be perceived in the city, all the passages separating the passages of the urine and excrement being corroded and destroyed. The whole mass of his body was turned into universal rottenness, and the living creatures and boiled animals were applied to the design of drawing out the vermin by the heat, by which a vast hive was opened. A second imposthume discovered a more prodigious swarm, as if his whole body was resolved into worms. By a dropsy also his body was grossly disfigured, for although his upper parts were exhausted and dried to a skeleton, covered only with dried skin, his lower parts were swelled up like bladders, and the shape of his feet could scarcely be perceived. Torments and pains, insupportable, greater than those he had inflicted upon the Christians, accompanied these visitations, and he bellowed out like a wounded bull, often endeavoring to kill himself and destroying several physicians for the inefficacy of their medicines. These torments kept him in a languishing state for a year, and his conscience was awakened at length, so that he was compelled to acknowledge the God of the Christians and to promise in the intervals of his paroxysms that he would rebuild the churches and repair the mischief done to them. An edict in his last agonies was published in his name, and the joint names of Constantine and Licinius, to permit the Christians to have the free use of religion and to supplicate their God for his health and the good of the empire, on which many prisoners in Nicomedia were liberated, and amongst others Donatus. At length, Constantine the Great determined to redress the grievances of the Christians, for which purpose he raised an army of 30,000 foot and 8,000 horse, which he marched towards Rome against Maxentius the emperor, defeated him, and entered the city of Rome in triumph. A law was now published in favor of the Christians, in which Licinius was joined by Constantine, and a copy of it was sent to Maximus in the east. Maximus, who was a bigoted pagan, greatly disliked the edict, but being afraid of Constantine, did not openly avow his disapprobation. Maximus at length invaded the territories of Licinius, but being defeated, put an end to his life by poison. Licinius afterwards persecuting the Christians, Constantine the Great marched against him and defeated him. He was afterwards slain by his own soldiers. We shall conclude our account of the 10th and last great persecution with the death of St. George, the titular saint and patron of England. St. George was born in Cappadocia of Christian parents, and given proofs of his courage, was promoted in the army of the Emperor Diocletian. During the persecution, St. George threw up his command, went boldly to the Senate House, and avowed his being a Christian, taking occasion at the same time to remonstrate against paganism and point out the absurdity of worshipping idols. This freedom so greatly provoked the Senate that St. George was ordered to be tortured, and by the emperor's orders was dragged through the streets and beheaded the next day.